Hi, I'm Matt Hayes and this is Angler's Paradise in Devon. Now I'm here to give you a few tips about float fishing, and the first tip that I can give you, if you're new to fishing yourself or you've got kids learning to fish, tip number one, take them somewhere where they're going to catch fish. They need to get activity because the attention threshold of people that are new to fishing is actually quite low, and I can't think of anywhere better than Angler's Paradise in Devon. It's full of colourful, zany fish. They're extremely active, and even though this is a cold day, the water in front of me is alive with feeding fish, so that's the first thing. In my day, the starter kits that we used for fishing were pretty poor, to be honest. Very heavy rods, inefficient tackle, the sort of stuff that you wanted to move on from very quickly. But this Matt Hayes stuff is really good fishing kit, and it will see you through quite a few of the early years of your fishing adventure. So I've got a Shaman rod. This is 12 foot long, it's the match rod. At 12 feet, that's a good length. A lot of people buy, beginners and kids especially, very short rods, but they're not very effective fishing tools. This rod's very light and very balanced, and it's easy for even youngsters to handle. It will help them cast further because of the extra length, and they'll connect with more bites and hook more fish. I'm not going to sell the products to you technically. What I will say is this: when you spool the reel up, if you're going to float fish, spool it up to the lip of the spool of the reel. You can see how I've done it here. That's very important because when the line leaves the spool and you make a cast, if the spool is not filled up correctly, you'll get friction, and that friction will massively reduce your casting distance. It's caused by the line when it leaves the spool catching on the lip of it. If it's spooled up like this, the line will leave the spool much more cleanly, and you'll find it much easier and effortless to cast decent distances. Now, another tip I can give you is to match the line that you're using to the type of fishing you're doing. When we're fishing for big fish like carp and pike, we regularly use 10 to 15 pound reel lines, but for float fishing they just don't work. Why? Because they make casting the float very difficult. I see lots of people fishing with light floats like this, trying to use 10 pound, 15 pound thick springy line, and the dynamics are all wrong. For float fishing, we tend to use reel lines between 3 and 7 or 8 pounds maximum. We'd go to 7 or 8 pounds if we were fishing in quite snaggy water where there was a danger that if we couldn't power the fish away from the snag, it might get snagged up. But for general open water float fishing, 3 to 4 pound reel lines are absolutely perfect, and that's why this rod is rated for 3 to 7 pound lines. Now, for float fishing on still waters, this is the kind of float that you need. It's called an inserted waggler. The waggler bit comes from a historical thing actually, which I won't go into now, but basically floats that you attach bottom end only like this are called wagglers, and this is an inserted waggler because the tip is finer than the main body of the float. We use a finer tip because it registers the bites much more effectively. The amount of resistance it offers to the surface tension is much less than the main body of the float. So when we're fishing with an inserted waggler, we dot it down nicely so that only the insert is showing, not the main body of the float, and it's much easier then for the fish to pull it under, and therefore the bites look more dramatic. Putting shot on the line always causes problems for people because most of the people I see, especially newcomers, just haven't got a clue where to put the shot. So let me make this really easy for you. When you're fishing with a waggler style float on still water, the bulk of the weight of the shot should be around the base of the float. In this case, I've got 3 number 1 shots, and they make up around 2/3 of the whole weight needed to bring this float down to about that level, cock it to about there. So you've got the bulk of the shot, and that's why we call it bulk shot, around the base of the float. Down the line we use smaller shots, number 4s and number 6s, number 8s. And the basic rule of thumb for myself is that I always put the first shot at about half depth. The second shot is below that, and then we've got a third shot here. Now let's go up from the hook. The nearest shot to the hook is the smallest one. That's a number 8, and it's just, I don't know, just a few centimetres away. Shall we say about 10 centimetres? The gap to the next shot is a bit bigger. This one is a number 6. And then the gap to the next shot is even bigger still. This one is a number 4. And the reason for increasing the size of the gap as we go up from the hook is to stop tangles. If you shot it up this way, you'll get much, much less tangles. And the basic rule of thumb I like to follow is that I like to have a shot every couple of feet, or 2/3 of a metre. And there you can see it. They're spread out down the line, but there's a reason for having a shot in every place. This way we get the bait down to the bottom where we want it, generally speaking. We get a nice slow natural fall to the bait and we don't get any tangles. It's a really good rule of thumb. So bulk shot around the base of the float and then spread out about 1/3 of the shot loading down the line. Now I'm almost ready to cast out, but one further tip, and you'll find it in Matt Hayes' book of useful tips, which it goes with the Matt Hayes Adventure range, plumbing the depth. Most of the time when we're float fishing, it's very important to be fishing on the bottom, and it's no good just being on the bottom. We need to have a fairly good idea of the depth so we can set the float up accurately. Now, because that's quite difficult to show on film and much easier by illustration, get hold of that useful book of fishing, and in the tips section you'll find out exactly how to plumb the depth. Really important. Let's have a look at casting. This is an area where people get into all sorts of problems. The first thing to do is to make sure that your reel is filled up properly with the line coming up to the lip of the spool. Second thing is, try not to use a float that's too light for the job. If you find yourself forcing the cast, then there's a good chance that the float is too light. The technique's fairly simple really. We start off with the left or the right hand, depends whether you're left or right handed, at the bottom of the rod, and then the upper hand, basically the fingers are spread either side of the reel stem like this. Trap the line and then open the bail arm. That means that the line can now flow freely off the spool of the reel. Bring the rod over your shoulder, left or right, and imagine a big clock face behind me now. I'm going to bring the rod back to about 1 o'clock, and then I'm going to accelerate forward, stop the rod and release the line at the same time. So that's quite a lot of things to do at once. Let's go through them again. We're going to have around about 1 metre of line between the tip of the rod and the float. Place our hands in the correct position. Trap the line against the butt of the rod with the index finger. Open the bail arm. We're going to bring the rod across the shoulder like this. There's the big clock face. The hand on the clock, we've only got one hand unfortunately, is pointing to 1 o'clock. And what we're now going to do is pull with the lower hand, push with the top hand, make a short acceleration and stop, and as the rod passes my shoulder, I'm going to release the line. It's a very simple movement.